everybody knows who I am, but if you don't, my name is Jody Steiger. I am the president of Oscar Joe Bryant Foundation, and I am also the aide to the Inspector General. Tonight, we are gracious enough to have the Inspector General Mark Smith here with us today, along with Assistant Inspector General Django Sibley. I'll do a quick bio for them, and then we'll definitely get started. So, start off with Mark. So, Mark Smith is the Inspector General for the Los Angeles Police Department. Um, he's born and raised in Los Angeles. He got his bachelor's degree at Cal Berkeley. Then he got his law degree at UCLA. Go Bruins. From there, he during his college years, he actually did an internship with the Inspector General's office and later came to work for the Inspector General's office in the early 2000s. After that, he left and went to the Chicago, correct, Mark? He went to Chicago. He was the first deputy chief administrator for Chicago Police Department Independent Review Office. After that, he left and he became the independent police advisor for BART, which is up in the Bay Area. And then from there, he was the constitutional policing advisor for the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department before he came back to us in February 2018, and he's been the Inspector General since then. So, Mark, welcome. And we also have Django Sibley. Django is the Assistant Inspector General in charge of the use of force section for the Office of the Inspector General. Django is originally from Hull, England. Sunny Hull, correct, Django?
That's right.
Django spent about 7 to 8 years in Hull Police Department, Django?
6.
6? Okay, he was a police officer in Hull for 6 years before he came over to the United States, where he got his master's degree at USC. Prior to that, he was at the University of Liverpool. He started working for the Inspector General's office in 2004 and became the Assistant Inspector General in charge of the use of force section in 2007 and has been there ever since. Both of them are nationally known as experts in their fields, and I just wanted to say welcome and thank you guys for joining us today.
Thank you, Jody.
Thanks, Jody.
So, before we get started, Mark, would you mind telling us a little bit about what the Inspector General's office does?
Sure. Well, thank you again for the introduction. I did see, by the way, the little fight on sign that was there for the mention of USC. So it is being noticed. I got it. And really, just hopefully briefly, before we turn to the real agenda for the evening, just a quick thank you to Oscar Joe Bryant Foundation for doing this. A thank you to Jody in particular for doing this. And I just need to mention briefly when I came on as the IG, and I got to learn that Jody was assigned as the aide and had been there for a substantial amount of time already. I had every expectation that he would be a good sort of resource and liaison for us to the department, a guide as far as some of our use of force questions and decisions, a guide on policy questions, etc. All those things were true. What I did not recognize was how completely and endlessly dedicated he is just watching out for the interests of officers and both sworn and civilian employees throughout the department, including putting on events like this with OJB. And just to see him always have that mindset is something that's been kind of admirable and inspiring to me as the IG. So Jody, thank you for doing that.
Thank you. I'll send you your money after.
You're right. I think as long as we're going online, just Apple Pay it or, just easier. I'll try to do the brief version about the OIG, and I give Jody you full exercise to hit my mute button if I'm going on too long about it, but I'll promise to try to be brief. I've had the chance to meet at least 1 or 2 people in person that are on this call, which I'm very pleased about, but that means there are a number who are on this call who I have not met in person, and I feel badly about that. I wish this could be in person, but I'm glad I get to at least talk with you now and have an online meeting, if nothing else. The Office of Inspector General is often talked about as the eyes and ears of the Police Commission. We report directly to the Commission. I know many people on this call probably know this, so I'll try to make it, again, the summarized version. where our office is about just under 30 people, all civilians, except for Sergeant Steiger, who's assigned to the office. Otherwise, all civilians, but we have a real variety of backgrounds, which I think is one of the great strengths to our office as we conduct oversight. Our backgrounds certainly include a contingent of former law enforcement, both here in some Los Angeles Police Department specifically, some other agencies here in Southern California, and some in agencies abroad as well. And so it provides us some really nice perspectives from folks who have worn the badge and been in the profession. We have folks with law degrees like myself. We have auditors who have specifically sort of certified auditing experience. And then we have, of course, an IT team, an outreach team, an administration team that supports our whole office. So we try to really have a varied background that I think makes us stronger in able to do really effective oversight. And the last part of it that I want to mention is the way that we do oversight. We have a few different primary sections in our office. Jody mentioned Django, my partner tonight, who's the head of our use of force section. And I'll kind of defer to him to go through some of the use of force discussion that we're going to go through. He's got the greatest expertise of, frankly, anybody that I know on these matters. And so he's the greatest teacher that we could have for our brief webinar tonight. Use of force section reviews, amongst other things, all categorical uses of force. We get immediate notification from the DOC. We send out an investigator to the scene, and we stand quite literally side by side with FID investigators as they initiate their investigation. We follow the investigation through to its end, and at the end of the day, when the police commission is going to hear each categorical case and make an adjudication of in policy or out of policy, the chief has recommended findings that they consider, and we have recommended findings that they consider. They look at both of those before making their decision. Oftentimes, our recommendations match those of the chief. Sometimes they do not. And so that's again, too brief, but a brief nutshell for our use of force section. Two others. One is our complaint section. We are an intake point for complaints of misconduct from any member of the public or any department member as well. So people, particularly if they don't feel comfortable making their complaint to the department, they can come to us. They can actually walk into our office when it's not COVID restricted. They can email us, call us, fax us, send us a social media post, whatever they want to do to make their complaint. And then our complaint section also monitors internal affairs as they conduct their investigation. So we have real-time access into every complaint investigation that is pending and has been completed. We can listen to the interviews conducted, look at the evidence gathered, and our goal is to monitor. We can't look at all of them at once, but in particular with ones that we're concerned about or high-profile incidents, we can watch and try to make sure that the internal affairs department, internal affairs group, or sergeants out at areas are conducting investigations in an impartial and fair manner and are doing so thoroughly. And then the last section that I'll mention real briefly is our audit section. They look at really systemic issues across the department. We put all of our audit reports online on our website. Everyone should be able to see them. And we look at major issues, things like data-driven policing was one of our recent reports. We did a recent report last October on stop conducted by the department that got a lot of discussion by the commission. And in those reports, we make recommendations where appropriate, where we think that the department can maybe do something better. And we try to tell them how to do that. In our opinion, those recommendations are subject to approval by the police commission. And if they approve them, then they're in force for the department. So again, I meant it's really brief. I'm happy to answer more questions on any of that if there are any, but I know it's a little off our main topic tonight. But again, thank you to Jody, and thank you again to my partner Django, who's going to be talking about use of force a lot, just for having his expertise to share with us.
Thanks, Mark. So with that being said, we'll get started. So let me share my screen real quick.
Is that coming up for folks?
Yep, perfect.
Okay.
Yeah, that's weird. I don't know why it wouldn't let me do it. We just practiced it about an hour ago too.
Okay, hopefully that's it, and I'll do my best to advance the right way.
Okay, perfect.
You
All right, you
ready?
can go to the next one. Yep.
Okay.
Actually, you know what? I have a quick see here. I want to read off a quick, some guidelines for everybody real quick, if I could. So first off, let's make sure that we be respectful to everyone and everyone's opinions. So as we go through, if there's something that you maybe don't agree with or anything, just be respectful. Secondly, please mute your video during the presentation. We only have one quick video that is about 2 minutes, but as long as everybody's video is muted, then that allows the video to play a little better. Second, questions will be taken via chat or live after the presentation. Also, during the presentation, if you have questions and you want to don't forget them or put them in the chat room, feel free to put them in the chat room at any time and we'll get to them at the end of the presentation. And during the question and answer session, please use the raise your hand feature and unmute your video, and then you'll have your opportunity to ask your question live. But other than that, Mark, if you can go ahead and go to the next slide.
Yeah, should we, you want to play this video?
Yes, you can play the video.
Okay, cross fingers, hope this works.
Yep.
You might have seen the headline today, police won't fight California's use of force bill. This is a big deal, but what does it even mean? Let's connect the dots. We first need to go back to March 2018 to the shooting death of Stephon Clark. Outrage poured into the streets after people learned Clark was killed by police in his grandparents' backyard. Amid protests emerged Democratic Assemblywoman Shirley Weber.
We're not saying that law enforcement officers can never use deadly force. I want to stress that. Deadly force can be used, but only when it is completely necessary.
She introduced a state bill that would limit the legal standard for police use of deadly force. Under that bill, AB 931, the use of deadly force as defined by a police officer would be limited to situations where it is necessary to defend against a threat of imminent or serious injury or death. Currently, case law says deadly force is prohibited unless there is a reasonable fear of death or serious bodily harm. Basically, changing the word reasonable to necessary could result in more officers being held criminally responsible for shootings. The whole thing caught police associations off guard, and the bill was never passed. But as they say, new year, new opportunities. In February, Weber introduced a new bill, AB 392. That got a lot more state lawmakers involved. In the last 3 months, the bill has been revised several times. There have been passionate protests for and against its signing. A competing bill, SB 230, was even merged with it to add more training for officers rather than just focusing on accountability. Now in May, after several revisions, the bill now reads, homicide by a peace officer is deemed justifiable to include when the officer reasonably believes, based on the totality of circumstances, that deadly force is necessary to defend against an imminent threat of death or serious bodily injury. All of this, according to the Associated Press, is apparently enough to get 2 major law enforcement organizations on board. Look, it may sound like a lot of legal jargon, but a small difference in words to us could mean big things for future police shootings. With more organizations, lawmakers on board, the bill has a better chance of moving forward. It is headed to the Assembly floor for a vote before it heads to the Senate, where it could face even more changes. Of course, we will be watching to see what happens next. You might have seen that.
All right. Thanks, Mark. So obviously we know that the bill passed and also along with it was SB 230. So if either one of you would like to chime in on some of the major changes in the policy, from my understanding, specifically for AB 392, most of the changes came with adding a lot of verbiage from Graham versus Connor, which is the United States Supreme Court case. Is that correct?
Well, I think if I can take that question, Jody, so the law changed. It came into effect at the beginning of 2020. Since the beginning of 2020, LAPD has actually had no less than 3 different versions of its use of force policy. culminating in Special Order number 23 of 2020, which was approved by the Commission last year, which is our current use of force policy, and that's what's going to stay in place for the foreseeable future. The really significant change in the policy from what we had previously is not as significant for us as it is for a lot of other agencies. It was already the case that there was an expectation, and this goes back all the way to 2016, that there was an expectation that for the use of deadly force, you would be assessed based not only on the moment when the force was used, but on the tactics that we used and the decisions that were made leading up to the use of deadly force. So that meant that, you know, the various tactical techniques that officers are trained in would be taken into account in determining whether or not their use of force was reasonable. So that concept, you know, was already in place in LAPD policy. For all other force, of course, anything less than deadly force, the standard was objectively reasonable. So conceptually, there wasn't a huge shift for us when we implemented the new policies, or when the Police Commission ultimately approved the new policies in 2020, to go from reasonable to necessary for the use of deadly force. But there's a lot of other details in the policy that I think we're going to go through, Jody, as we go through the following slides, that are important to understand what the expectations are. And in particular, what I want to do as we go through these is to highlight for you what is new and different and important for you to understand about the current policy.
Thanks, Django. With that being said, let's get started with the preamble. Were there any major changes to the preamble that you're aware of?
Well, I mean, I think that the preamble is substantially the same. The important thing with the preamble as it continues is that the preamble references reverence for human life. That's a value that the department has had for many years as a core value.
I think that's also, can you go to the next slide, Mark? Thank you.
It also, the preamble indicates the expectation that you will employ de-escalation techniques when safe and reasonable to do so, or safe and feasible to do so. The important thing to understand about this new policy is that although de-escalation isn't new, the level of emphasis that the policy gives it is new. So it's mentioned no less than 3 different times in the policy. It's mentioned in the preamble, it's then mentioned in the policy itself, and then it's mentioned again in the factors to determine reasonableness, which is something that we'll come to in more detail in a little while. So if there's anything that you should take away from this policy, it's that it sets a very clear expectation that you will employ de-escalation techniques whenever you have the opportunity to do so, basically. And we don't need to talk about what those are, because I'm guessing that everybody who's on this call is familiar with de-escalation training and the patrol model. But you really need to be able to demonstrate that if you're, demonstrate your adherence to it when you're going about your work every day, so that should you become involved in the use of force, you're able to indicate all of the things that were done consistent with that patrol model to try and reduce the likelihood that there would need to be a use of force in any particular incident that you're dealing with.
All right, thanks, Django. All right, next slide, please, Mark. All right, so let's talk about de-escalation techniques. If I remember correctly, Django, I believe in 2016 or 2017, the Police Commission put an emphasis on de-escalation in the use of force policy, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. So the training was introduced, I think, 2016. So it's been around a while. Everybody's been trained in it with the patrol model, planning, assessment, time, redeployment, other resources and lines of communication being the conceptual model that all the officers are trained in. I think everybody's familiar with that. I think what's changed since 2016, if you look from 2016 to the present day, is that the degree of focus on that patrol model of training in the evaluation of use of force. One of the things that I do in my role is that I attend all of the use of force review boards, and if any of you have ever attended a board, you may have seen me there. I've been to most of them for the last almost 17 years. The presenting captain and the board members are literally going element by element through that patrol that patrol model on every case to see how it's applied. We're doing that in our analysis. The chief of police has a specific section in his report for that, where he has to indicate for each component of the patrol model what the officers did or didn't do. And the commission is very closely examining that in its adjudication ultimately of the case when it decides whether or not the officer's tactics were appropriate. And because de-escalation is now part of the use of force policy, in determining whether or not a use of force was within policy or not as well. So the de-escalation training has really got a central role now, it's a central focus of the review of categorical use of force. And as we're going to talk about in a little bit, it's also now a requirement for force that isn't deadly. So a lot of that force that is going to be dealt with through the non-categorical process, there's also a requirement now that de-escalation be employed when the opportunity is there to do so.
Thanks for mentioning that too, Django, because I was actually going to mention that as well. It's very important that everybody understands that, de-escalation is not just for deadly force situations or categorical uses of force. It's for any and all use of force. So, yeah, great. All right, next slide, please. All right, so verbal warnings, is that something that's new?
There is something that's new about verbal warnings in this policy. And I mean, you all know, from your training and your experience that if you're going to fire a beanbag at somebody or something like that, you have to give them a warning, right? That's been long established. What this policy says is that for any use of force or prior to any use of force, you've got to do two things if it's reasonable opportunity to do so. One is to identify yourself as a police officer, and the other is to warn the person that force may be used. So that expectation now is established for all use of force. Doesn't mean you have to do it in every single instance, because as you know, there may not be an opportunity to do it, or you may require the element of surprise in some instances. But the general expectation is that those warnings will be given prior to a use of force if the opportunity exists.
Now, Django, I know Post put out a video and it specifically talked about making reasonable efforts to identify yourself. And the district attorneys that were on there specifically said, well, obviously, if you're in uniform and driving a marked police vehicle, that makes it, you're making a reasonable effort to identify yourself. So does that mean in our policy, does that mean that even if you're wearing a uniform, you need to still say I'm the police, or is that just kind of a given?
It's a really good question. It's not. It hasn't really been tested yet, Jody. Is the honest answer as to how far that expectation goes. Obviously, if you're in uniform, there's most people are going to understand who you are, and it might be redundant to tell them that you're the police. Although there's no harm in doing it, if you've got the opportunity to do so, just to make sure. There may be people that don't understand that. I mean, I'll just make one observation. An observation that struck me when I first came to Los Angeles a couple of decades ago now, was that you don't have police insignia on your uniforms very often. The public is expected to understand what that badge is. For instance, if you're from a different country, I don't know, you might not know that blue uniform means that you're a police officer. It doesn't have police in it in bold letters in many instances. Sometimes it does, but often it doesn't. So there's no harm in identifying yourself. I think as well as many people will know from your own experiences, there are people that even though you're standing right there in front of them in your uniform, they don't know who you are. And that might be because of their state of intoxication, maybe a state of mental health, or some other kind of crisis situation that they've got going on, and it may not be clear to them who you are. So I think it's always, you should always err on the side of caution with that and verbally identify yourself if in doubt. I think that's a good approach to take to that. I think that would be reasonable.
Right, and I always like to mention to officers that the key to that also is where feasible. That's where it starts, right? Where feasible. So make sure that you understand that this is not something that you have to do at every single second when somebody just jumps out of a bush and attacks you. You don't have to identify yourself and give them a warning. You can take action immediately. So it just says where feasible. So just keep that in mind. How about proportionality? What does that mean?
Well, it really means what it says there, that you can use a level of force that you reasonably believe is proportional to the seriousness of the suspected offense or the reasonably perceived level of actual or threatened resistance. So somebody who has committed a minor crime and who isn't presenting resistance, you are not going to, you're really not going to be able to use any force on that person. It really matters what the crime is and what the level of resistance is that you're encountering. Somebody who is presenting a very high level of resistance would, that might warrant a more significant use of force than somebody who's presenting less resistance. That should be obvious anyway. And also that the way that you would approach perhaps a murder suspect, who might reasonably be more kind of aggressive, for want of a better word, than the way you would approach a shoplifting suspect. You need to take account of the nature of the crime and of the level of actual or threatened resistance in coming up with the appropriate posture and the appropriate level of force in dealing with the suspect.
So would it be fair to say that's kind of another word for objectively reasonable?
I think it's a similar concept. I mean, if you're, somebody's committed a minor traffic infraction and you run up and take them down hard to the ground, that's not likely to be proportional unless there's something else extraordinary taking place.
Right.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks. Fair and unbiased policing. We've been hearing a lot about fair and unbiased lately. What does that mean?
It means that the list of factors that we have there, race, religion, color, ethnicity, national origins, and so on, should not be a factor in your determination of how much force you're going to use. So basically, the force needs to be based on the specific actions of the person and the specific facts surrounding that case, and not on the kind of identity type issues that are there listed on the policy. So you shouldn't treat somebody any differently, basically, based on what their race is. You shouldn't treat somebody differently based on what their religion is, so on and so forth. Their housing status, which is obviously, that's a big one in LA. We've got a lot of people who live on the streets. Those kinds of things are prohibited by law from basically, being a determining factor in how much force you're going to use on somebody. So use the same amount of force on the homeless guy as you do on the businessman. It's based on what those individuals are doing at the time. That's what's going to dictate the force that's appropriate. Nothing about their status in those other respects.
All right, thanks. And also, I'd like to mention too, most of these changes, if people aren't aware, are specifically because of AB 392 and SB 230. They mandated that departments have to have this language and policies for these specific topics. So just keep that in mind. All right, next one, Mark, please. Thanks. All right, so let's talk about non-deadly force. That's kind of a new term, right? We never really had that in the past. What does that really kind of mean?
Well, there's a really important distinction in the policy and in the law nowadays, but we're talking about policy today, but almost all of the new policy issues that we're talking about are based on the law. So it's one and the same in many instances. But the policy and the law divides force into deadly and non-deadly. And that's a really important distinction, because anything short of deadly, the controlling standard is objectively reasonable. Anything deadly, at that deadly threshold and on up, I mean, there is an on up from deadly, but anything that meets the deadly threshold is necessary. Necessary is the standard. And so necessary, another way of thinking about necessary is last resort. It means there's nothing else that you could have done. And we'll get to what necessary means, but basically you've got no other choice but to use deadly force. That's the only time when deadly force is authorized. The standard for non-deadly force isn't quite as tight as that. So we're still in the reasonableness realm for non-deadly force. And of course, the definition for deadly force is force which creates a substantial risk of causing serious bodily injury or death. And serious bodily injury includes things like unconsciousness, which is why, for instance, something like a carotid restraint control hold would be deadly force. It includes disfigurement. It includes a laceration that would require extensive suturing and a number of other things. So deadly force doesn't just mean force that's likely to kill somebody. It also means force that can create, this kind of higher level of injury as well. So, pushing somebody off the top of a fence might be deadly force. if the resultant fall presents a substantial risk of them, breaking the neck or, fracturing the skull or, being knocked out or something like that. So that's how we define deadly force. Deadly force necessary, anything short of deadly force, objectively reasonable.
Okay, good. And I think we'll go into that in some of the next slides as well. All right, some of the factors that determine objective reasonableness. Most of these factors came from Graham versus Connor. If we can go to the next slide, I think it'll show some of the factors. And most of these factors are pretty much the same from before, correct?
They are, and you'll be familiar. I mean, Graham v. Connor's been around since the 1980s, so probably for the entire career of everybody on this call, I would imagine. And so most of you will be very familiar with what's often referred to the Graham factors, a list of issues that that are considerations in determining what level of force is reasonable. And you see some of those: the level of threat or resistance presented by the suspect, risk of escape, et cetera, et cetera. There are two, though, and so we won't go on about. We're not going to talk too much about all of those long-established Graham factors. You should all be familiar with those. We're going to talk about two new ones. Two new factors that are added to this list in this policy and that are added as a result of the law that were not part of the original Graham v. Connor case and have not been part of your policies prior to 2020. And the first one is the one at the top of the list on this slide. And it's the feasibility of using de-escalation tactics, crisis intervention, or other alternatives to force. So even though, I made that distinction earlier on between deadly and not deadly force, even when that force isn't deadly, when determinations are being made of reasonableness, you still have to think about whether or not there are other ways that you can either avoid using force or mitigate the amount of force that's being used by employing de-escalation tactics. And remember that de-escalation tactics don't begin only when you get to the incident or when you encounter the suspect. They can begin before you even get there. It can be having a tactical plan, between you and your partner in the radio car on the way to the call. It can be assembling appropriate resources before you contact the suspect, et cetera, et cetera. So you need to be thinking about all of those kinds of things all the time, because if you do get into a use of force, the review of that use of force is going to look back through those decisions that you made leading up to that, even before perhaps you encountered the suspect. It could be from the first moment that you became aware of a situation, either through getting the radio call or seeing something happening, further down the block and you went up to investigate, or whatever the case may be, that de-escalation begins then. And so you need to be thinking de-escalation all the time, because that is going to be part of the analysis in even a non-categorical use of force. And if you didn't employ de-escalation techniques, or if you had the opportunity to and it was feasible and you didn't follow the training that the department's provided you on de-escalation, that could be a factor that takes away from the reasonableness of a use of force that happens as that incident unfolds. So that's one really important difference from the prior definition of objectively reasonable.
And that's where the P comes in planning as well, right?
That's right.
All right. Thanks, Django.
And there's another one on the next slide as well. And that, if you look all up, so the first one on the first slide was the new one, and on the last bullet point on this slide is another new one, and that is whether a person is a member of a vulnerable population. And a vulnerable population is actually defined in the policy, and just to make sure I don't characterize it, let me tell you what it is. It includes, for instance, the elderly, the very young. So for instance, some of you may have seen on the news a week or so ago, Buffalo, New York police using OC on a handcuffed 9-year-old girl. That would be considered a member of a vulnerable population. Because
right. I think it also includes people that are mentally impaired, people that are homeless.
So the list in the policy, it says it includes, but it's not limited to, children, elderly, people who are pregnant, people with a physical, mental, or developmental disability. Right. So somebody basically disability, young, old, pregnant, or other factors that might make somebody vulnerable, and that's an assessment that officers are going to need to make. But it could be somebody that's, having some other kind of crisis, or is very heavily intoxicated or, you know, emotionally disturbed in some fashion. We don't know exactly what that means because that's still relatively new and it hasn't been tested very much yet. But certainly whether or not somebody may be a member of a vulnerable population is going to be a factor in determining reasonableness, even for those uses of force that are not deadly.
All right, thank you. Next slide, please. All right, drawing and exhibiting. Now I know that in the past we were probably one of the only, if not the only department for years that had a policy on drawing and exhibiting. Has that changed at all?
I believe it has changed, and there is in fact so our policy on when you may draw your weapon has not changed. I mean, or not significantly changed. You can see the language there, but it amounts to the same thing.
Right.
What's changed is that now there's a requirement to report when you point a firearm at a person. So, you know, having your gun out during a building search, if there's no confrontation with a suspect, no guns pointed at anybody, that wouldn't be something that would need to be reported, for instance. But if an officer actually points their firearm at any part of a person's body, then that's the pointing of a firearm at a person, and that is now, as by in law and in policy, required to be reported.
Okay. Next one, please. All right, now we're going to get into deadly force. So what were some of the, or if there were any significant changes in the use of deadly force?
Yeah, so this is where the necessary standard comes in. And it's really important to understand what that means, and we'll talk a little bit about that. There are two reasons why you can use deadly force. The first one is to defend against an imminent threat of death or serious bodily injury to the officer or another person. That's not a new concept to anybody, right? The threat has to be imminent. What's important to understand, though, is what the definition of imminent is, because in the past, at least in the way that policies are written, there's been a distinction between immediate and imminent, with immediate being a tighter standard than imminent was. And for the last decade or so, LAPD's policy was imminent, but that was understood that it's very close at hand, but it didn't necessarily have the same meaning as immediate, which means that it has to presently be dealt with.
Now, I remember, Django, when I first started, and I'm sure a lot of the people on here will remember too, we never used imminent, we used immediate.
Yes.
Right, and it changed, I think it was like 2008, 2009, it changed, right?
It changed, yeah, I think it was 2009 maybe, it changed. And that was understood to make this a little bit more permissive, I think. Well, even though it still says imminent in this policy, if you look further down the policy at the definition of imminent, the definition of imminent is that it has to be that it's immediate.
Right, and I think that comes directly from the law, right?
Yes. So that's not an LAPD didn't invent that definition of imminent. That's from the law, as you correctly say, Jody. So basically, imminent means immediate. So the standard now is that there has to be an immediate defense of life type situation before you're authorized to use deadly force, and it has to be necessary for you to do that. So if you have some other means of addressing that immediate deadly threat and you have a choice, then you don't get to use deadly force. What it also means, though, which is I think even more important to understand, thinking back to the de-escalation stuff that we've been talking about already, is it requires that you've appropriately used the de-escalation techniques that you had the opportunity to, that were feasible leading up to that situation where the deadly force occurs. If you could have employed de-escalation techniques according to your training, but you don't, and you kind of by a consequence of that, you get yourself into a situation where deadly force is then employed because you found yourself facing an immediate threat, even though in the moment you may very well have been up against an imminent threat of death or serious bodily injury, your force may still be found to be unreasonable based on your failure to employ other techniques in the lead up to that encounter that culminated in the use of deadly force. So, let's say, for instance, something that's a very obvious immediate threat of death or serious bodily injury might be somebody pointing a gun right at you and they're 5 feet away from you. That is in the moment indisputably an imminent threat of death or serious bodily injury. But if you have not used proper foot pursuit techniques and then chased that person into a house on your own and then chased him into a bedroom upstairs, and now you're in a one-on-one confrontation with him, and there wasn't any exigency that justified you using those tactics and getting yourself into that confrontation, then shooting that person could be in violation of this policy because of the decision making that you undertook that got you into that place in the first place. And that's a fairly extreme example. But that kind of analysis is going to be carried out now in connection to every single use of deadly force that occurs. And so officers' actions leading up to that use of deadly force, whether there were other options available to them, whether it was feasible for them to employ those other options, whether they employed de-escalation training, whether they had the opportunity to do so, and if they did have the opportunity, whether they properly employed the de-escalation techniques that they've been trained. All of those questions now are going to become part of the analysis to determine whether or not that use of force was in fact deadly. I mean, sorry, not deadly, whether it was in fact necessary. Yeah. That's what I mean. So whether or not it was necessary, and that's the analysis on the policy front. But what's really, really important to understand is that that's also the legal analysis. So not only might an officer land themselves in hot water administratively and get an out of policy use of force, and then whatever discipline might flow from that, they could also violate the law and find themselves criminally liable also if they haven't, if they've used deadly force when there were other alternative and lesser techniques that could have been employed.
Now, if correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe it was around 2013 or 2014, the Inspector General's office had made a recommendation to the Police Commission about implementing what people consider the Hayes Doctrine.
Yes, that's right. So this isn't as new a concept for us as it is for a lot of other agencies, because a lot of other agencies until 2020, they just said you can use force that's objectively reasonable, and with objectively reasonable defined in terms of what Graham v. Connor says. What happened in, I think maybe 2014, was that there was a case, Hayes versus County of San Diego, where the California Supreme Court said that a determination of reasonableness can include consideration of the tactics and decision making leading up to the use of deadly force. So that had become part of LAPD policy several years ago, taking that language that was in the Hayes decision, and that was incorporated into LAPD policy. And we did have a number of cases over the years, although not all that many, where the use of force was found to be out of policy, not based on what was happening in the moment when the force was used, but based on deficient decision-making leading up to that use of deadly force. What I would say, though, is that this new policy puts a much greater emphasis on that. So although the concept was already around, I think that the level of expectation is much increased under this new policy. It's like I said earlier, de-escalation comes up 3 separate times in the policy. By the time you get to deadly force, there's been three statements in the policy saying that you need to have used de-escalation here if the opportunity was there, if it was feasible to do so. So it really underscores that point, I think, with a higher level of emphasis than we had in the prior version, even though the concept isn't entirely new.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Sorry, I was going to say, Jody, the other reason you can use deadly force is on a fleeing felon. But again, look at the language on the slide here. It's that if it has to be, you can only use it on a fleeing felon if the officer reasonably believes that the person will cause death or serious bodily injury to another unless immediately apprehended. So if there's any other possibility that they could be apprehended, at a subsequent time, then a fleeing felon use of deadly force is not going to be within policy. Now, LAPD doesn't have a lot of fleeing felon shootings. And I think, based on this, then we'll have that will continue to be the case if we ever have any at all. It has to be because that threat will manifest itself if you don't immediately act with deadly force, and anything short of that, deadly force isn't going to be authorized.
Yeah, I know for fleeing felons, the way it's traditionally been taught with LAPD is that pretty much you have to exhaust all options. There's no other option that you would have available before you could use deadly force on a fleeing felon.
And to use it right then. So if they've still got another block to run before that threat's going to become manifest, then you can't use it yet. You'd have to wait for them to get, closer, or give them that additional opportunity. So it has to be that need to use that deadly force to stop the fleeing felon has to basically be immediately necessary.
Right. So I think to kind of sum it up, like you mentioned earlier, and I think it's a term that's familiar to everybody on on this webinar right now, is that in essence, to use deadly force, it has to be a last resort. You had no other options.
Yeah, and that's a really good way to boil it down. The way that the policy defines it is as follows. In determining whether deadly force is necessary, officers shall evaluate each situation in light of the particular circumstances of each case and shall use other available resources and techniques if reasonably safe and feasible. Now, that doesn't mean if you get ambushed with gunfire that you've got to try and de-escalate, because it wouldn't be reasonably safe and feasible. But if there is any other course of action that you could reasonably and safely, feasibly take, that is the expectation. You shall do that. You shall not just go to deadly force, if there were other options. And what that boils down to is really what Jody's saying. What it means in common language is it's got to be a last result. There's nothing else you can do. We have no choice here. The only way that we can address this imminent threat is to use deadly force, and that's it. And if you're at that point, then deadly force is authorized. If you're not yet at that point, then deadly force is not authorized. That's what the policy.
Yeah, a term we used to use a lot was either you've exhausted all other options or those options are unfeasible. So,
right.
All right.
That's exactly it.
All right. Thanks. Let's go to the next slide, please. There we go.
There's another component of this. I don't know if it comes up. We've already talked about this, so let's keep going on the. We've already talked about that. There's one other aspect of the deadly force policy that's new. I don't think it's on the slide, but it's important to mention. And this is new. This did not used to be in the policy, and it's that you have to consider your surroundings and risks to bystanders. You have to. That is now an expectation of the policy. So if there is an undue risk to bystanders of the way that an officer uses deadly force, then that could be a factor in determining whether or not the deadly force is reasonable. And so that might, if the officer has an option on how to make an approach, one that's safe, one that's unsafe in terms of bystanders, that's where those considerations need to come into play. Controlling your fire in terms of, number of rounds and accuracy comes into play there. Weapon selection can come into play there. So those kinds of decisions as well, and where you are considering or you're making choices that affect the degree of risk that bystanders may be subject to, are a factor now that's considered in the use of force policy as it relates to deadly force.
Oh, a lot of this sounds familiar to stuff that we used to use when I first started. There were a couple of acronyms we always use. One was IDLE, which I know you're familiar with, and the other one was BALKS, right? And BALKS, the B standing for background. So background, then A for age, and so on and so forth. But this sounds really familiar to, it seems like we're kind of gone full circle, right? We kind of went away from that stuff and now we've kind of gone back to it. So that's interesting.
It is, and I think from the policy standpoint, Jody, you're right. What's new though is this is also the law now.
Right.
So you could get yourself in hot water legally by not adhering to this. Whereas in the past, those were policy standards only, but now it's policy and it's law.
Right. Yeah, because the way we used to teach it, when I used to teach LETAC was, and when the policy was different, was that our standards were more strict. So even if you violated policy, you didn't necessarily violate the law. Now it's one and the same. So basically, if you violate policy, you're violating the law too, and you can be criminally held liable, correct?
Yeah, I mean, kind of theoretically, yes. Of course, there's a different standard of proof. It's a preponderance of the evidence for administrative versus beyond a reasonable doubt for criminal. So just because you got an out of policy use of force doesn't mean that you're going to be prosecuted.
Right.
And also, the prosecuting authorities don't have access to your compelled statement in the same way that the administrative reviewers do. So there are some differences in the standard of proof and the kind of evidence that's evaluated. But you're right, in terms of the standard is basically the same.
All right, thanks. Now, rendering aid, that's something that's new, right? I know that that was something that was talked about and implemented a few years ago, but now we have it specifically in the policy, right?
Yep. So now if a person is injured, you have to call them an ambulance, and to the extent of your training and based on the equipment you have available to you, you have to render first aid to them.
Now, what if
now, there's exceptions, you know, that that doesn't mean that if there's an ongoing gunfight that you have to start, you know, you have to stop what you're doing and start giving first aid. What it means is once everything's code 4 and it's safe to do so, and if you've got first aid training and you've got a first aid kit in your car and your suspect is bleeding, then you need to, you know, or suffering some other kind of injury, obviously you've got to make that RA request, but in the meantime, while you're waiting for the paramedics to get there, you also need to provide first aid as well to the, you know, to the extent that you're trained to and to the extent that you've got that equipment on hand.
Now, let me ask you a question. Say I just got involved into shooting, right? And so I'm dealing with the effects of that, and you know, I'm still kind of like in shock, and you know, I'm dealing with the, you know, the emotions that I'm dealing with, and I'm just not thinking about rendering aid. Will I get in trouble for not rendering aid at that point?
It doesn't make an exception for anybody. Basically, if you're a police officer, you're there, you've got the skills and the equipment to render aid, and a person needs that aid, then the policy says you shall provide that.
Okay. All right, thanks. Next slide, please. All right, warning shots. Was there really change in warning shots at all?
No, not changed. Basically, you know, only in exceptional circumstances. As it happens, LAPD has very few warning shot cases.
Right.
Just only a few in all of the years that I've been here, and so, you know, to all intents and purposes, you're not to fire them. It would be a very remarkable circumstance where that would be appropriate. It's not to say that those circumstances can't present themselves from time to time, but the takeaway from the policy as it is now and as it has been in the past is that, generally speaking, or outside of some exceptional circumstance, you're not to fire warning shots.
Okay.
And if you did, I should add to that, Jody, as well, that you would only be authorized to do it if there was an imminent threat of death or serious bodily injury. So
Right.
if given how high the threshold is for using deadly force, I don't know why you'd be using warning shots at that point anyway. If it really was that imminent, you know, meaning immediate, then you probably don't have time for warning shots at that point.
Well, if you'll indulge me for a second, I don't know if, do you know the story behind, the history behind warning shots?
I don't know that I do.
So the story behind it was there was a situation down in Pacific Division where officers took a suspect into custody. I can't remember what he was in custody for, but as he was getting taken into custody, the citizens around tried to lynch him from the police. So they started to surround the police and basically back the police all the way up into the ocean. And so it got to a certain point where the police felt obviously in fear for themselves, either drowning or being attacked by this mob. So instead of taking their weapons out and shooting into the crowd, they basically took their weapons out and they shot up in the air, and then everybody scattered. And so at the time, we didn't have any policy for warning shots. So then Commander Daryl Gates said, well, wait a minute. Would you have preferred that they shoot these people, or would you have preferred that they did the warning shots, what they did. So he came up with a term to prevent taking a life by not taking a life. That's the only time we could use warning shots. So just kind of little LAPD history trivia there.
Interesting.
Yeah. All right, next slide. All right, shooting at or from moving vehicles. Has this policy changed at all?
Has not. As everybody knows, since 2005, it's been the general policy of the LAPD that you don't fire at moving vehicles.
And that didn't that stem from the Devin Brown shooting?
It does stem from the Devin Brown shooting, and it applies to cases where the vehicle is the threat, as opposed to somebody shooting at you from a moving vehicle, for instance, which is an entirely different situation. But where the vehicle is the threat, basically the rule is if you can get out of the way, that's the expectation. And the only time that you would be authorized to shoot at a moving vehicle is if you or a victim is not in a position to get out of the way and is going to be imminently subject to SBI or death, and under that circumstance, then potentially there could be the use of deadly force against or use of a firearm against the driver of a vehicle. But generally speaking, we're not authorized shooting moving vehicles, and that policy is the same now as it has been since 2005.
Right. Now, I remember, I believe a year or so ago, we had an incident when it was caught on video. I think it was in-car video or body-worn video, where some officers were driving down the street and they were following a vehicle, and then the person started shooting at them. Now, they were okay to return fire because the person was shooting at them, correct?
Yes, because the threat that they were addressing was not a threat that was posed by the movement of the vehicle. It was a threat posed by the guy who had a shotgun shooting at the officers. That's right.
Right. Okay. Thanks. All right. Next one, please. All right. It says it is understood that the policy in regard to discharging a firearm at or from a moving vehicle may not cover every situation. Yeah. So kind of what we just talked about, right?
Yeah, that's exactly what we were just talking about. That's right.
Okay. All right, good. Next one. All right. Oh, now this is something new, right? This is something that comes directly from SB 230, I believe, right?
Yes.
Right.
So
and I know.
Go ahead. Well, there's two things that you need to know. Right? LAPD's always had a general policy that you have to report misconduct. That's not new. But what's new is that we now have specific requirements that were established in the use of force policy as it relates to this. So if you believe that somebody used excessive force, you have to report that to a supervisor. If you believe it, you have to report it. If that force is clearly excessive, that's the word that the policy uses, or clearly beyond that which is necessary, is what the policy says, you have to intervene to stop it. So if your partner or some other officer on a scene where you are is using clearly unnecessary force and you do not intervene to prevent them from doing so, then you could be liable under the policy. Administratively, you could also be criminally liable. Of course, it doesn't define what intervene means. Intervene might be, you could intervene verbally. I think it would be a rare instance where you would need to intervene physically, although we've actually had that happen from time to time over the years, where officers have intervened physically in a circumstance like this. Well, they've done that just because of it was the right thing to do. They've done it in the past. We've seen instances of it, but now it's a policy requirement. So if there is clearly unnecessary force taking place, you're there, you're aware of it, and you don't intervene to stop that, then you would be in violation of this policy.
Okay, thank you. And I believe we're coming down to the end. I think this is the last one. There we go. Yeah. Was there, before we get to questions, was there anything else, Django, you wanted to add?
No, nothing. I mean, we've hit all the main points on the policy there. What I will say is that, speaking for myself, if anyone ever has questions about use of force policy or any part of the use of force investigation or review process or anything like that, then I'm always happy to take the time to answer any questions anybody's got. So there's my email address. Don't be shy to contact me if you think there's something I can be of assistance.
And I can attest to that, everybody, because before I even actually got to the Inspector General's office, when I was at Southborough as a training coordinator, I emailed Django, and because I had some questions to ask him about use of force. And so we actually started corresponding, and I met him, and we actually became friends prior to me actually getting to that office, just simply by an email. So he does actually respond to the emails. So does Mark, and they're more than happy to hear from you guys. So with that being said, thank both of you for being here. And now let's open it up for questions. If anybody has any questions, what I'd ask is if you raise your hand, which will put you in area, so that way I can actually unmute you, and then you can ask your question live. You can, if you want, you can unmute your video as well. So with that being said, are there any questions from anyone? I don't see any hands yet. If you guys don't know where the hands button is, if you go down to the bottom of your screen, it says reactions, and you can put raise your hand there. It says raise your hand, or you can give a thumbs up or anything else like that. So anybody, or was Django really that good and you guys don't have any questions? I'll give it a few more seconds here. Oh, here we go. All right, Marlon, you can go ahead and unmute yourself.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Okay. One of the concerns I've heard from officers about the necessary as it's been presented and not yet tested, I guess, in precedent. But so we talked about if their tactics or their decision making has put them in a perilous situation, and then a suspect were to wield a knife or present them with an imminent threat, and they defend themselves, they're going to be out of policy. So in order to not be out of policy, if I've made poor decisions that got me to this point and the suspect is trying to kill me, in order to not be out of policy, I just have to let him win. I have to run. I have to hope I save my own life by not using deadly force, because I'm going to be out of policy and against the law. How would we respond to that particular sentiment or assessment?
Thanks, Marlon.
Well, I think it's a great question, and it's obvious. I mean, it's kind of an obvious question that arises from this. I think, though, that officers are going to, if it's a question of saving their lives, they're going to have to do what they need to do. But the real takeaway from this is that they've got to really focus on that decision making that's going to either get them into or keep them out of those kind of situations. What this policy means, I think, in practical effect, is that it needs to really focus everybody on making sound decisions using good tactics. And if they're doing that, they're not gonna find themselves in that kind of a dilemma or that kind of a situation. I don't think anybody intends this, to mean that officers need to let themselves be murdered. That's not what this means. What it means is that it's supposed to create a strong expectation that officers use good tactics.
Thanks, Django. I think that was a great answer. And I'd like to stress to people that, although this is new to some of you, if you have less than 20 years on the job, for those of us that have more than 20 years, this is not anything new. Even if you have 30 years on, the example I always give officers is, if you heard, or if you want to Google the name Eula Love, and I believe it was 1976, there was a shooting where the officer's tactics were bad, and the police commission at the time said, well, wait a minute, if your tactics were so bad, it put you in a situation where you had to use deadly force, then we're going to say the whole use of force is out of policy. That happened back then, even though that wasn't a written policy. And then I believe in 1999 with Margaret Mitchell, it was the same thing. So, and then again in, 2015 with Ezell Ford. So we've had 3 cases before we even had any of this stuff that was actually written as a policy that showed this. So for us, it really isn't anything new, but now, like Django kind of has emphasized numerous times, this is law now. So not only is it policy, but it's also law. All right, so I think Rashad Sharif has a question. He says, how do we tell officers they don't have the use of different tactics in 77th and West LA? Officers feeling more dangerous, so they think they have used different tactics. So, okay. So I think what he's saying is, do officers in 77th Division and West LA have to use different tactics, or is everybody looked at the same? Because maybe one area is more dangerous than another area. I think that's what Rashad is trying to say.
Well, I think you've got to use tactics that are appropriate to the specific situation that you're dealing with. And you may encounter certain kinds of situations more frequently in some parts of the city than you do in others. But exact like for like, I think the tactics should be consistent. And I think that when we talk about the kind of the fair and unbiased piece of the policy, that somebody doing exactly the same thing, one of them in West LA, one of them in 77th Street Division, that they should expect a similar kind of police service, based on what their actions are. Now, if you've got particular knowledge of a situation that is related to the place where that situation is taking place, that may be a factor that you weigh in determining what's appropriate in terms of the way that you address that situation. But always got to be based on specifics. If it's based solely on where it is, and that place, you might have a particular location that to be a particular threat, gang location, something like that, that's going to change the way that you go about something. But giving somebody a ticket for a traffic violation in one part of town or another part of town, absent some specific indicators that one situation is different from another, I think that the tactics would be similar, or that would be the expectation.
Right, I agree, and I like to have Mark chime in on this as well. As Inspector General, and obviously, speaking on behalf of the Police Commission, do you feel that if an officer says, well, hey, you know what, it's more dangerous in 77th than it is in West LA because there's higher crime, so I should be able to use different tactics, or I should be a little bit more aggressive, you think that'll fly? You think that would be okay? Let me make sure you're able to speak here. Go ahead.
Thanks for that, Jody. Yeah, no, I think Django answered it correctly. And in response to the question, which I think is a really valid question to think about, I would ask, are there other parts of the LAPD manual or other policies that are treated differently, from place to place, or does that policy manual apply to everyone in the department everywhere? And I think if I can share really quickly a sort of civilian perspective, when I first came to this type of work and doing oversight for law enforcement, and it was with LAPD, one of the things that I, as an outsider, someone who had never, had experience in this profession before, I was surprised by something that you might find dumb or stupid, which is totally fine. But I was surprised by how much of the evaluation of officers' tactics was based on whether or not they kept themselves and others safe. There was a really strict analysis, not so much on did they use excessive force or did they use more force than they could have, and that was its own analysis for sure. But there's a lot of time spent on did the officer do things as safely as they could. And I didn't realize that there was such a focus on that, and I appreciated it. I think it's really a great thing for a department to focus on. And so if that's the focus for the department, that should be the focus of the department everywhere, regardless of whether you're in 77th, where there are, a higher number of shootings versus West LA, where there's a lower number of shootings. So I think the focus should always be the same. And the bottom line is that the policy itself, which, as we just heard, is guided by law specifically, applies to every officer in every place and applies equally, just like every other part of the manual does. There aren't some parts of the manual that apply more or less, at least in my opinion, to different places. It applies to everyone department wide.
Thanks, Mark.
Can I just add something to that, Jody?
Yeah, go ahead, Django.
That one of the dangers that we've seen from time to time in reviewing cases is officers being complacent based on thinking that they're in a safe, basically allowing the environment to lull them into a false sense of security, and that they fail to use, apply their training and use proper tactics. So I think you've always got to think about particularly what is it that you're dealing with, and apply the training that you have based on the particulars of that situation, irrespective of where it's occurring.
Okay. Thanks, Django. All right, Rashad had another question. So Rashad, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Thank you for answering the other questions. My internet is messed up, so hopefully I'll get it out quick. Being out in the community, when I tell citizens, they always say, oh, you guys, you say, hey, you can make a complaint against them. And they say, oh man, y'all just policing each other. Y'all know y'all ain't gonna find this person guilty. You know, y'all take care of each other. I heard earlier that you guys said you review these internal affairs. How can I go back to the community and say, look, not only do we have internal affairs, but we have the inspector general that looks at these? How do I make them feel comfortable that the investigation is going to be fair and not just on the officer's side?
I love this question. Thank you for it. It is, I admit to you, it is an uphill battle. I've always seen it this way, both in Los Angeles and other places I've been to. It is an uphill battle to convince people of that. But it's one that we will continue fighting, because you're exactly right. I know that response. I've seen it myself too. Just as you said, you just, you look out for yourself, you watch out for each other, and that's going to be the answer at the end of the day. What I hope is that you can tell them exactly what you just said. Look, we have layers of accountability in our department. Yes, I as an officer can be looked at by my supervisor for my actual basis. I can look at by internal affairs in a more formal way if you file a complaint against me. And we can also be looked at by an external body of civilians who don't report to the chief of police. He is not my boss. I have nothing, no reason to please him. I report to the police commission, who are civilians appointed by the mayor. And if you don't like anything the department's doing or that their internal affairs is doing, you can go tell the inspector general and they will take a look at it for you. It can be an endless argument. Some people you'll never please. I fully realize that. I try to talk to folks in the community when I can, and I realize there's some that you'll never please. They'll say, well, you work for the city. And so since you work for the city, you're part of the family too. And so you're just going to protect the rest of the city members as well. And so I say, well, you can go outside the city. You can go to the newspaper. You can go, wherever you can go. It can be an endless argument, I recognize, and sometimes you'll never win. But what I find strength in our system, as well as some others, is layers of accountability. If you don't like what I did, you can talk to my supervisor. If you don't like what my supervisor did, or you don't like what the supervisor's response was, you can file a complaint. If you don't think that's going to be true, you can go up another level and go to the inspector general's office, who are, and you can explain to them, they're not members of the department. Or more specifically, they don't report to the chief of police. They're outside that process. If you don't like what the inspector general does, go to his boss. I have a boss too. My boss is the police commission. They have meetings in the public every Tuesday, including allowance for public comment. And if you want to go and say that you think the inspector general did a lousy job and just covered up for his friends who are officers that he works with all the time, go to the police commission. They're my bosses, and tell them, and they'll make a determination if I did my job right. And if you don't like what the police commission did, you can go to the mayor, et cetera, et cetera. It's a hard sell. And that's why I referenced the uphill battle before, because I've had that conversation too. But to answer your question, what I do hope is that every officer would feel free referencing our office, giving our contact information. We will supply. If you want business cards for us, I'll supply as many as you can take. We've got brochures. You can have as many as you want. And if you don't want that stuff materially, at least let people know, hey, we have Inspector General. You can find it online. We're on LAPD's website. There's a link to it. We should be easy to get to, even though we're kind of small. Tell people that they should know it, and they should take use of it, so they can hopefully feel confident that they got another pair of eyes that's not just a member, a uniformed member looking at something.
And if I can chime in on that, Rashad, and for everybody else too, that doesn't just go for the community, it goes for all of you as well. If there's something that's going on that you feel like you're being treated unfairly, or maybe a complaint that you had, you don't believe was investigated, fairly, then you can come to us and, the office, we have a section that specifically looks at complaints and audits complaints, and they can review that complaint. And if they don't feel it was done fairly, then they go directly to internal affairs and says, well, hey, you know what? We don't think this was done fairly. You guys need to look here, or you need to look there, and you need to re-interview or do something else, or you totally missed the ball on this one. So it works for us. I've seen it work for us. I've seen numerous officers who've contacted me personally. And just for you guys to understand, if you contact me, I don't have a duty to where I have to go report it to the department. In my position, that I don't have that responsibility. I can give that information to the Inspector General's office, and therefore at that point, the Inspector General's office can do their investigation, and I'm not liable for that. And then also, if you want to remain anonymous, you can also remain anonymous as well. So just keep that in mind.
Not to belabor the point, but I used to work for the Inspector General's office before I left and came back as the IG, and I was in our complaint section, and this is back in the early to mid 2000s, and so I was one of the people who actually reviewed internal affairs complaints, and I'm not going to be super critical of that. I think there are a lot of times when we would say they did things well, we agreed with their outcome, they did things thoroughly in an unbiased fashion, and they deserve credit for it. But I remember writing up some criticism sometimes. I think, by the way, I haven't checked, but I think they've actually improved in a number of ways since then. So there shouldn't be a lot of criticism to necessarily go around. But there was one in particular where they really did a poor investigation. They asked poor questions, they asked leading questions, and they shaded things in favor of the officer when they really shouldn't have. We criticized it, and it was important enough, this particular complaint, that it made its way up to the chief, and I was lower down then, but I got to sit in a meeting with the chief then, who frankly scolded his internal affairs folks and said, you can't be doing this. It's unacceptable. And my point is, again, not to criticize, but just to validate your question, to say there is an actual process whereby we look at these things very critically. And if we find problems, we're going to make a stink about it. And so people in the public should hopefully know that, even if it's a tough task to let them know.
Thanks, Mark. Anyone else? Is there any other questions? Going once, going twice, any hands going up? All right, well, if there are no other questions, I'd like to thank the Inspector General, Mark Smith, and the Assistant Inspector General, Django Sibley, for joining us tonight and sharing that, wealth of information about the use of force policy, and giving us, all the expertise that they have on the use of force policy. Because believe it or not, you guys, during the process when these policies are coming out, especially when we're talking about the use of force and stuff like that, the Office of the Inspector General is engaged in those meetings and giving recommendations and making advice. So that's why they're so familiar with this policy and many others. So with that, I'd like to say thank you both. I appreciate it. And good night, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Jody.
Thanks again, Jody. Appreciate it.